fire that I told you was not going to jump the fire breaks, jumped the fire breaks, and then spread 3 miles in minutes in like all directions. We had no idea where it was going to go. And he said, I tried calling you over and over again, but you must have been out of service. And he just kept, it was very apologetic. He said, yeah, like the section that you were walking through had burned down by the time that you had gotten out. And he was like, he's like, you are very lucky that you made the moves that you did. And that was definitely one of those moments where you didn't realize how close you were to potentially not getting out of that until after the matter.
In this podcast, I talked to Harrison Bacordo about some of his experiences walking two of the most difficult trails in the world. The first one being the Araroa in New Zealand, a trail that starts from the top of the North Island and ends at the bottom of the south. And secondly, and more recently, the Pacific Crest Trail, which goes from Mexico to Canada. We're going to hear some fascinating stories from what it was like day to day at the trail, meeting people and forming these beautiful connections, and finally facing your mortality in a bit of a life and death situation. I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast as much as I enjoyed recording it. And without further ado, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Appreciate it, man. And we can just call it the TA from now
The
on.
TA,
We can make
yeah.
it simpler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's start with the TA. The TA is what the vertical distance of New Zealand, right?
Yeah, for the most part. It kind of meanders left and right here and there, but it's about 3,000 kilometers from top to bottom.
Right. And what motivated you to walk the TA?
I guess in my head, I thought before I jumped into, the regular work life, I wanted to try something adventurous and kind of get a taste of life without so much responsibility. And so I figured the natural time to do that would be between graduating uni and then also starting my first job. And so kind of in that period, I thought, like, what better way to kind of figure out more about yourself and also go on this really crazy adventure that I've seen other people do before, and it's always just struck me as something that they seem to get a lot out of. And so, just kind of a sense of adventure. Thought it would be really fun to do.
Oh, wow. And this is the whole distance of New Zealand, right? How long does that usually take?
It varies. So usually 4 to 6 months is kind of the expected time. So it starts from Cape Reinga, which is the top of the North Island, to Bluff, which is the bottom of the South Island. And I finished mine in 4.5 months. But, a lot of it's dependent on the weather as you go through, because, if you go through, especially in the North Island, if you hit a certain section right after it's rained, it can be really horrible with mud. And then that can slow you down by, a day at least, maybe multiple days. And so, yeah, it really just weather dependent or just depending on your pace or your fitness. But 4.5 months was what I did.
Yeah, right. And so if the weather's really, really bad, which I imagine it can be in New Zealand quite often, what do you do? Do you just hide in your tent, or do you go out into a motel? Are you allowed to go out into a motel, or are you trying to be a bit more serious about it?
So you can go into motels, and I did go into my fair share of motels on the trail every now and then. Like, after every few weeks, I might just think, how great would it be to have an actual bed for once, and then just get a motel and split it with all of the people that I'm hiking with to make it a little bit cheaper. And so that's definitely allowed. But no, whenever you're in the middle of a section and the weather turns to shit, there's really no choice but to just go out there and do it anyways, which is one of the really beautiful things about the trail, is that there's a certain level of grit that you kind of have to, that if you don't have before, you will develop if you persist. And so it was a really fascinating thing where, I feel like a lot of people, they wake up in their houses and they look outside and they see rain, like, yep, today's an inside day. But whenever you're doing a trail like this, every day's an outside day. You're not just going to sit in your tent, you're going to walk. And so was really an interesting way to see how far you can push, I guess, the limits of your willpower to some degree, because it does take a lot of grit to do that every single day on end. So yeah.
Yeah, right, for sure. Um, Speaking of it's almost like humans. Do you think humans were almost bred to be outdoor creatures, right? Like thousands of years ago, whether it was raining, whether it was sunny, people would be walking outside, right? Did you get that feeling, or do you feel like we're actually kind of more domesticated now, and that it's actually better to be in the safety of the home? Yeah,
No, I definitely agree.
yeah.
I think that I think the world would be a lot better if everyone would just take an hour of their day to just be outside for a little bit and walk, and just, not be surrounded by all the concrete jungle that we tend to be surrounded by these days, but just to go out in nature and just be unplugged, listen to the sounds that nature produces, and kind of be surrounded by, whatever landscapes around you, whether that be forest or mountains or desert. I just think there's really something missing by not doing that. And so, no, I think that, it's almost like we were forcibly domesticated to some degree, as technology has kind of improved. And so I think that, yeah, I think a lot of people would benefit from being outside for at least an hour, and at the most extreme for 6 months. That really, yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Was there anything that you learned that you didn't expect to learn from the trail? Or anything that surprised you? Like, when you hadn't done the trail, you would have had an impression about what you thought the trail would be like, right? But I
Hmm.
mean, imagining actually doing it is a completely different thing. Was there anything that like really surprised you, or um, didn't meet your expectations, or perhaps over exceeded your expectations?
Yeah, I think especially on the my first trail on the TA, one thing I did not expect at all was for the people on the trail to be what really makes it what it is. I always thought that I'm going to be, you know, before I started the trail, I had thought, oh, this is just going to be a walk through nature and that's about it. And, that does bring a lot of benefit. But what surprised me uh, was my goal beforehand was to just go through it as fast as possible. But the people that I met along the way really slowed me down, and kind of it made me realize, what, maybe there's more to this trail than just what's around us. It's also who you meet. And because, you meet a lot of fascinating people on a trail like this. I feel like the average person in the your average person isn't going to be doing a trail like this, and so you're meeting a lot of really unique people. And whenever you're out in nature for this long, and a lot of time without any service, and without much in the way of distractions or coffee shops to go to or restaurants to eat at, you just have yourselves. The bonds that can be formed from that are really something unlike, I don't really know a great way to replicate those kinds of bonds. And so that was something that really surprised me, was just how attached I was going to be to the people I meet, and how strong those bonds would be, because, camaraderie is a huge part of the trail. You're all, you people think that a lot of people go into these kinds of trails thinking that it's all going to be sunshine and rainbows. Turns out it's usually not the case. A lot of times suck. But the thing is, those times of suck really bring people together, because it's, everyone on the trail is going through the same thing. And so something I definitely did not expect was just how much of the trail was going to be centered around the people. And so when I did the Pacific Crest Trail this year, I made it less of a focus on what was around me in regards to landscape, and obviously that was still a part of it, and I really appreciated the beauties that nature provided and the diversity of nature. But I really made a focus this time to make sure that I wasn't trying to go through it as fast as possible, and I was going to try my best to just to form as close and as connected of bonds with the people around me as I can. And I like to think I did a pretty good job of that.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, it's it's almost like in the one world we're so distracted with all these things, and we have to work, and we have all these commitments. But it sounds like walking on the trail is kind of like going back to that tribal sort of thing where you just have a few people around you and you don't have all these different things, and so the bonds that you form are way, way, way stronger, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a struggle with coming off of a trail, is that you go from, one extreme of, having little responsibility except for, pretty much surviving. That's your one responsibility, and getting from point A to point B, and, eating and drinking and whatnot. And that's about all your responsibility. To go from that back to, I guess the quick pacedness of, everyday life. And it can be quite a shock to do that transition, because you go from, feeling very free, in practically every way you possibly could feel free, to I guess, the realities of the world to some degree. And it sounds very dramatic, but it's definitely something that a lot of people coming off trail struggle with, is trying to find the same kind of happiness, that they've had on trail, elsewhere, whenever they go back into the real world. And so it's definitely something that a lot of people that I know struggle with, something that I am struggling with, and that I struggled with even after I finished the TA, is just, getting back into the rhythms of, air quotes, society.
Right. Has it changed your outlook or philosophy on life?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing I definitely learned about myself while I was on trail was I put way too much meaning into these singular moments for some reason. Like, a good example of this was on the Pacific Crest Trail. There's, it goes from Mexico to Canada, and it's about 2,600 miles, or 4,400 kilometers, let's say. And one thing I'd always dreamt of before I started the trail, because this is something I was planning for since high school, was getting to the northern terminus and on the Canadian border, and kind of seeing that as my accomplishment made, or my accomplishment gained. And then as we were getting closer to Washington, or Canada, the wildfires tend to be a pretty big problem, as the season goes on. And we were in Oregon and Washington, which is the northern parts, the northern states, as you go through the, Pacific Crest Trail. We were going through it during wildfire season, and we got pretty unlucky in the sense that before we could reach the Canadian border, where that terminus is, the monument caught on fire, and so it was closed off from anyone to enter. And so everyone was kind of, they had been making northward progress for, at this point, 5 months, and now you're 2 weeks away from the end, and the one thing that you were heading toward is now closed. And so it's almost like it's almost like you do a marathon. You've been building up to do this marathon for let's say a year, and then you're half a kilometer from the end, and you're being told you can't get to the finish. And so that's what, I and everyone else on trail that was with me and behind me had to go through. And to me, my initial response was, well, the trail is ruined to some degree. Like, I'm not going to be able to accomplish this goal. But I think that was a very short-sighted perspective, because it's not like the trail's defined by me getting, like, by me being at the monument, or being on the Canadian border. What makes that moment, what would have made that moment so special, would have been the journey to get there, and all the moments that happened in between the Mexican border and the Canadian border. It never should have been about the Canadian border. It should have just been about the adventure that you had getting there. And so, it took me it took me a few days of reflection and, pondering on that, while I was walking. Because, once they found that out, me and a lot of other people started thinking, well, what's the point? Like, what are we walking towards at this point if it's not going to be that monument? We're still walking, but why are we walking? It became very demotivating. So, it was a very important lesson for me to learn that, I shouldn't put so much emphasis and so much significance on those singular moments. It should be about the progress that you made to get to what would have been that moment. to some degree. And so that was a very important lesson for me to have learned. And we ended up reaching the border in a different way. We didn't go the monument way, but there was a different route that we could have taken. It had to be by boat, and so we just took a boat up to this one trail and reached the border that way. And so that's kind of how we finished. But moral of the story is you just don't. I put way too much emphasis on singular moments when I just really didn't need to or shouldn't have.
Yeah, right. It's almost like a blessing in disguise, in the fact that it taught you that valuable lesson, and now you have like a really unique story to go with it. So that's actually a really, really beautiful, like ending to your story.
Yeah, exactly. Not the ending. If anything, it makes it all the more special because the end of the PCT for the vast majority of people that hike it is that they get to the Canadian border or they get to the monument. But this, we finished the Pacific Crest Trail in a different way. Our story, or the story that I had and that many other hikers had, didn't finish the normal way. It kind of had a plot twist, you might say.
Exactly.
And we had to navigate around that, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I guess cool once we actually did it. But whenever we found out that we weren't gonna have the ending that we thought we would, it was initially pretty not great. But that's you after pondering on it, it's okay.
What was the feeling when you finally arrived to the sort of the end of the trail? What was that feeling like?
So it's interesting because a lot of people would think that there's this buildup of emotion and that it's almost like you're standing at the top of a ginormous mountain and you feel like you're on top of the world, and you feel as if you finally achieved your goal. But what really happens for most people is they get to the border and then it almost doesn't hit you immediately. Like it's not something where you just feel like it's over immediately. And so whenever we got to the border, very candidly, we got there, we had champagne, we popped champagne, we all just kind of reflected a little bit on the adventure that we had just gone on. And we were doing this the last few days of trail just to start. And so almost to some degree, we kind of spread out all of the emotion that we would have felt at the very end. We spread it out over a few days by just taking that time to reflect and with each other, make sure we understand, how lucky we were to have been able to take on such a challenge, such a hike like this, and really reflect on the friends and the people that we made and the things that we saw and the memories that we made with each other, and making peace to the best of our ability with the fact that it was going to be over soon. Because once you reach the end, once you reach Canada, or once you reach the end of the trail, that's the beginning of the end to some degree. And so, there wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of visceral emotion coming out. It was much more spread out and a lot more weirdly at peace with what's happening and kind of just staying in the moment. So
That's awesome. That sounds like such a beautiful moment.
yeah.
How long is the PCT compared to the New Zealand trail you did? Is it double the size? Because it looks huge on the map. I mean, it's for people that don't know, the Pacific Crest Trail is from Mexico to Canada, right? So it's that vertical distance, which is basically the vertical height of America. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. No, you're pretty much right. And again, like the TA, it does meander left and right here and there. But yeah, so the lengthwise, the PCT is, I think it's 4,400 kilometers, 4,300 kilometers, one of those, or 2,600 miles about. Whereas the TA, I think it's 2,000 miles or 3,000 kilometers. And so in time, you usually take about, it's actually kind of interesting because even though there's a significant difference in distance, it's still, you're expected to complete it around the same time. So 4 to 6 months for each of the trails is about the same. And the reason being, the TA has much harder terrain. In fact, it's known as one of the hardest these are called through hikes, like long distance hikes. It's known as one of the hardest through hikes in the world because of how, not just New Zealand's unpredictable weather, but, the mud ends up playing a huge problem because of that. The rivers can be extraordinarily dangerous to cross. it's raining more times than not a lot of the time. And so because of all of these external factors that the TA has, it takes about the same time to complete as the PCT, which is a horse trail first, well, funnily enough. And so because it's a horse trail, it's very well graded, very well maintained, never too steep because a horse has to be able to do it. And it's also very well maintained because of the fact that the PCT is a lot more popular or a lot more walked than the TA. It's a much older trail, has much more of a history to it. And so more people know about it. And especially after there was a movie that came out about it called Wild, which had its own kind of a thing. But that's how a lot of people found out about the trail. And then they, because of that, the demand for the trail increases. And now, it's just because of the how well maintained the trail is and how well graded the trail is because it's meant for horses. It's just much faster or much easier to cover distance than on the TA, which is, if you've ever hiked anywhere in New Zealand, it's pretty rough sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, man. No, it was definitely two very different trails in every sense of the word.
Yeah, right. Did you find that when you were, because you did the TA first and the TA was so difficult, when you got onto the PCT, it was a bit more like a walk in the park? It was kind of like, oh, this is really easy. This is way easier than sort of I was anticipating.
Well, no, to some degree, yes. And I met some people that had done the TA before the PCT as well, and some of them they did it at the same time I did it, and we crossed paths, and some people I recognized, some people I didn't, and everyone that I ran into agreed that the TA is just so much harder to complete because of there's much more of a it's much more physically demanding, but because of the physical demand, it almost inevitably also is more mentally demanding because you're doing something hard every single day, and it takes a lot of willpower to keep yourself doing that. Whereas on the PCT, there were a lot of days that were, I would never say that hiking all day long is ever going to be easy per se, but there were definitely days that felt much more like a walk in the park than not. And on those days, it was just like, it's a breeze. Like you could walk, 40, 50 kilometers pretty easily in a day on the PCT, whereas on the TA, you would never do that.
Right.
And so definitely easier in the way of how you're walking or the terrain that you're walking on. But it had its own challenges, especially logistically, because with New Zealand, one of the big struggles of hiking a trail like this is water. Is trying to make sure you maintain your water supplies and make sure you're not about to thirst yourself to death to any degree. And New Zealand, the entire country is water pretty much. There's nothing but water everywhere you go. Like every 5 or 10 kilometers, you're guaranteed to see water to some degree that you could drink from. On the PCT, the first 1,100 miles are desert, and so you were run through, sometimes 30-kilometer sections of no water, and so you had to plan out water ahead of time. Carry, I think the most I carried was 6 liters of water at a time, and that really weighs you down. And especially, even with 6 liters, you have to conserve the water that you have. Like there were many times where I had run out of water a few, maybe 5 or 6 kilometers before the next water source, and I just kind of had to deal with it. And I had no other way but forward to get to the next one. And so, there was definitely challenges on the PCT logistically, much more than the TA. And with the TA, you're going through a lot of towns like every 2 or 3 days, and so you have the opportunity to kind of shower and get real food for once, and have all the town amenities. Whereas on the PCT, sometimes it's 7 days and there's nothing for you, and so that can also be very mentally draining. And so overall, for sure, the TA is harder than the PCT, but the PCT had its fair share of unique challenges along with it.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds like you had to do a lot of planning. I mean, 7 days without knowing, you know, if you could get any items. So you'd have to plan those 7 days, what you'd eat, what you'd drink. 5 liters. I mean, I'm hoping there's a water source between those 2 points in those 7 days, because I think you need to have at least more than 5 to 6 liters a day, not five to
You would
five.
hope
Yeah,
so.
was that a scenario where you just had those 5 liters, or was there quite a few water stops between those two towns?
The on the 7 day
Yeah, the
stretch.
7 day stretch. Yeah.
Yeah, so the 7 day stretch, I should probably just lay out how the PC, like the terrain or the landscapes the PCT goes through. Their first 700 miles, or let's say 1,000 kilometers, is the desert, and then after that you have about say 600 to 700 kilometers of what it's called the Sierra Nevada, which is a really gorgeous but really demanding and high altitude mountain range that goes through the middle part of California. And then from once you get out of that, you have Northern California, which is pretty much all just forests and trees, and then Oregon, which is the same as NorCal for the most part, and then Washington, which kind of towards the end of Washington you start experiencing the mountains. And so the 7 day stretch that I went through was through the Sierras. And what's nice about this is that because it's a very high alpine environment, there's a lot of snow, and in the summer there's snow melt, and so you had snow that you could, that if you needed to, you could melt, but there were also rivers almost everywhere. Not to the degree that the TA in New Zealand had by any means, but there was definitely to the point where you really only had to carry a liter of water at a time, if that, before the next river that you would cross that you could grab water from. And so thankfully I had none of those 5 liter stretches in that 7 days that I was through the Sierras. So
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. It's interesting to realize that there weren't like water stations. Like I would have thought there'd be water stations, but now I'm hearing that you have to find a physical water source. So you have to find a river or a lake or something, and take up the water. I'm guessing you have to boil it, or you have to put in some type of ingredient to purify it, right?
funnily enough, no.
Really, you
so
just drink it straight from
so
the source.
no, so there was only one section where we had to either boil or use an iodine tablet. I think that's what it was. And that was a section that was very infamous for giving people norovirus. And so and only in that stretch you have to, like, do that strategy for filtering. But most of the time you just do, I'm not sure what the word for it is, but it's like a physical filter. So you pretty much just push water through a whole, like, really this, what is a filter, and that just has a lot of really tiny pores, and you just push the water through that. It gets rid of all the impurities and 99.9% of viruses and whatnot, and then it's usually clean to drink. Think of it like a Brita filter, but really small.
Oh, right, fascinating. And was that the same in the TA in New Zealand? Because I know New Zealand rivers, well, I've at least seen signs and stuff saying don't drink from the river, right? Was it the same deal there, or slightly different?
Yeah, so mostly the same deal. In the South Island, you almost never filtered your water. You didn't need to, and there were times we did that on the PCT as well. But one of the important thing to be mindful of when you're filtering or when you're grabbing water is to know what's upstream from it. And the North Island of New Zealand is just a lot of farm, and so is the South Island. But where the trail goes through, it's a little bit less farmland. But in the North Island, you're always going through farmland, and so upstream you always assume it's a cow farm, and so you want to be very mindful and obviously filter that water because you don't want to drink cow shit.
Yeah, right, for sure. And you mentioned that you met some people at the TA, and then you met them again at the PCT, right? That sounds kind of crazy to me. That, I mean, you did the PCT, what, 2 or 3 years after the TA,
Mhm.
and you're meeting the same people just randomly on the trail. Yeah, how
Yeah,
was that
yeah.
experience? Was that, because I'm guessing you didn't expect that, and you just kind of bumped into them, right?
So the people that I ran into on the TA, we at least some of them, some of the people I ran into on the TA that I also ran into on the PCT, we had each other's contact information. Like they follow me on Instagram or something, or vice versa. And so I was aware of some people that were doing the PCT that I knew from the TA, and so we just went back and forth a little bit, trying to saying, oh, like maybe I'll see you all on the trail. And but the actual act of seeing them was always was a surprise, because I didn't know when I was going to see them. But yeah, it was very funny. One of the times, it was, only 5 or 6 days into the PCT, and I was setting up camp, and I turn around and I see this lady that I had met on trail. I saw her right there, just out of nowhere, and so we just had this really big reunion of, holy shit, didn't think I would run into you this soon, or at all, and was definitely a very one of the more interesting memories I had of the PCT was just the times that I ran into people that I had known beforehand. But there were also people that I had run into that had done the TA the same time I had, but I never ran into them, or I didn't know who they were. We had just crossed paths, like we probably just waved to each other or something, and then kept on going. And then through conversation on the PCT, we realized, oh, we did the TA the same time, and our trajectories that we took would have meant we crossed paths. And so there was a lot of those as well. And so, yeah, definitely interesting running into people, but running into people that But the through hiking community is pretty small, and there's only so many through hikes that people like usually do. So one of them being the TA, and then there's 3 in the States, and the most popular one to do is the PCT. And so it was, is the through hiking community being so small and there being only so many options to hike. I think that kind of makes it almost inevitable that you're going to run into sometimes the same people.
Small world, eh? That's so surreal.
Very small world.
Yeah. It's so interesting to think about, like, how many billions of people live in the world, and how few people actually do through hiking, right? Like, how many people do you think do the TA and the PCT every year?
So I think for the TA, the number is somewhere hovering around 2,500 to 3,000 a year attempt it. Now, to say who finishes it, it's usually less than 80% of that. So usually it's about, let's say it's a few hundred people will actually get to the end of the trail. And for the PCT, has a little bit more demand because of, I guess, the history and the popularity of it. And so for the PCT, it's looking more like, I think it's 4,000 to 5,000 people every year will do it. And same thing as a TA, only about 80% of them, or only 28% of them will finish it. And what's funny is that now, whether this metric is true or not, I'm not sure, but I would totally believe it just based off of pure observation. But by the time that you get to about 7 days in trail, there's a town called Julian. And by the time that you get to Julian, most of the people that are going to quit have probably quit by then to some degree, or whether they have physically gone off trail and they thought that this isn't for me, or whether they've like kind of come to the conclusion that they're not going to finish the entire thing, and that they're going to end in, at the Sierras, or they're going to end in Northern California. Like they just realized that maybe they weren't ready for this, or their expectations weren't aligned by any means, which is a really big problem on the trail, is people starting the trail thinking, again, it's going to be all sunshine and rainbows, or I watched this movie Wild, or I read this book Wild, and I think I'm going to have the same experience as the woman in that book or in that movie. And then they go on trail and they realize, okay, well, this is a much different thing, much different beast than I thought it was going to be.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I would have thought a lot more people would have done it to realize it's just, a couple hundred or a couple of thousand that actually complete it every year. That's kind of mind blowing, especially because of how huge America is. And I just would have thought more people. Wow. It definitely makes sense that that you bump into people then, eh? And form these quite meaningful connections. I mean, it's such a shared path to be able to do that. Requires a lot of perseverance. I suppose it's kind of like ultra marathons, right? The ultra community isn't huge, and the people that do ultras are really, really dedicated and they absolutely love it. So you can really get to the top or be known in the ultra marathon community without too much effort. I'm guessing it's similar here too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way to relate it to that, you could think of the first few hundred miles of a through hike as just a regular marathon, which isn't really that exclusive, isn't that hard, or I mean, it's a difficult challenge to try to accomplish, but it's not at the same level as an ultra marathon. And so, you could do a marathon and you could recognize no one that's doing the marathon to some degree. Like it's a whole bunch of faces you've never seen before. And it's like that for the first few hundred miles of the trail. But as you go on further and as the challenge becomes more demanding, or as people start dropping off the trail, you start entering like ultra marathon territory where, okay, now like the people I'm running into every day are the same people all the time. And it's because most of the other people are either ahead of you by a good enough distance that you're not going to run into them, behind you a good enough distance that you're not going to run into them either, or they're off trail, which is almost everyone, which is the vast majority of the people. And so at that point, you kind of form a very tight knit community by like as you go on, because there's only so many people that you're going to run into while you're on the trail. And so the desert's known as being very socially chaotic on the PCT because it's the beginning of the trail and everyone's trying to find their bearings and meet everyone else, and also because there's everyone on the trail at that point. But yeah, once you get to Northern California and especially Oregon, things really start to dwindle down and you start running the same people over and over again.
Right. And now that you've done two through hikes, would you be interested in doing an ultra, or is that something that's not as compelling to you because of I guess you have to do it quite quickly. You do it in like 2 days over instead of over a few days.
Yeah. Whether I do an ultra, not entirely sure. I shouldn't say a lot. I know some people from trail that are training for ultras like after trail because they thought it was a natural next step for them. I can't say I'm going to attempt one or start training for one anytime in the near future. Maybe a marathon, maybe that would be fun to just try for a little bit. And then maybe if I enjoy doing the marathon, which I mean, honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of running. And so I can't see myself doing a marathon either anytime in the near future. But, anything can happen. I might get into a point in my life where I am seeking just another challenge, and ultras are definitely a challenge. So maybe that'll be in my card at some point in the near future or in the future.
Oh, nice. What fitness level would you need to do one of these trails?
Interestingly, you probably don't really need a certain fitness level. There was a lot of people that I would say were pretty unhealthy on trail. And there's something called trail legs, which it's a term that is coined on trail for once you are able to walk, like 25 miles every single day without feeling sore the next day. It's called when you have your trail legs. It's not like 25 miles like a concrete number, but it's more of whenever you feel well adapted to the day-to-day life on trail and you're not really sore as much anymore. That's when you have your trail legs. And so really, if you're not in proper trail fitness, the trail will make you trail fit. It's mandatory that you are. And so in order to start the trail, you don't really need any level of fitness. Obviously, the more fit you are, the more likely you are to succeed in getting to the end. But I've seen all different kinds of people get to the end. Some faster than me when I wasn't expecting it, and some slower than me also whenever I wasn't expecting it, because maybe I thought they were just in a much better level of fitness than I was. And so, the fitness comes from the trail. It's not something that is a prerequisite to the trail.
Right, that's fascinating. So, yeah, we don't actually don't need a train to do it. I can just do it tomorrow if I wanted to.
Honestly, no.
Wow.
And that is the interesting part, is that the amount of my training for the TA and my training for the PCT consisted of me making sure that I knew how to use my gear, which I think is probably the most, that's like the bare minimum of training you need to do is before you go out and live off of the gear that you're bringing on your back for 6 months, to make sure you know how to use it when you need to know how to use it. And so that's really the bare minimum that you need to do for the trail. And after that, I mean, again, it's really just everyone starts walking, say 11 miles a day or 15 kilometers a day, and they do that for the first 2 weeks. And they, as they get more comfortable with the walking, they start very gradually increasing the mileage. And so, um, a lot of people don't train before they start the trail, and then they end up just fine. Like I was definitely one of those people. I just didn't train much. I maybe went on like one overnight hike to make sure that I knew how to use the gear, but that's about it. The training that really needs to be done is to some degree mental training and kind of making sure that your expectations are managed. Because if you go into this trail thinking again that it's going to be nothing but a great time, or it's going to be nothing but sunshine and rainbows, you're not going to face any adversity, then you're going to be sorely disappointed, caught off guard by the trail, and then the trail's going to eat you up and spit you back out to some degree. And so really a lot of the training that you need to do is is managing your expectations and kind of um, trying making peace with the fact that you are going to be incredibly uncomfortable a lot of the time on trail, and just knowing that that's going to come. I think that's a very big part of preparing for the trail.
Right, right. Um, yeah, so when you speak about being uncomfortable, I'm guessing even the people that think it's sunshine and rainbows, they probably think, oh, it's going to be some level of uncomfortability, but I can get through it. It's going to be good overall.
Mm-hmm.
So their expectation of, or what it is, what it feels like to be uncomfortable might not be the level that you anticipated. So how uncomfortable can it get on the trail? What should somebody actually expect?
Yeah, so it's dependent on the section. So in the desert, it's a desert, and for the desert in Southern California, that means little to no shade at all times and nothing but sun at all times. Anytime there was a cloud in the sky, we thought we were very lucky. Like it would only happen every few days, and so there's a very large level of uncomfortability with being out in, I think the worst it got was 112 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I'm going to guess like 36, 37 C, I'm thinking. Maybe a little bit more than that. But walking out in that and not having any shade, and, because of that, your water levels are like, you need more water, but there's not enough water in the desert. And so now you're constantly thirsting yourself just to ration your water out. And the issue isn't like, that in and of itself, you can do that for maybe an hour pretty easily. But whenever it's dragged on for the span of days, it's days that you're doing this where like you want to drink, but you know that you're going to need the water that you want to drink now. You're going to need that more later on. And so you have to kind of live with this kind of constant state of being uncomfortable for until you get to the next town, which could be a day away, or it could be 3 days away. And so always fighting for shade. There's a very popular strategy in the desert, or just two. One is shade hopping, which is where you find shade and everyone congregates in there. And so you might have 20 people all taking a rest in like a very small area that just happens to be shaded. And as the sun moves, you kind of move with the shade. And then once you're done with that break, everyone just starts walking again until they get to the next shady spot, which, God knows where that's going to be. And so just because, taking a break out in the sun it feels horrible. And then the other strategy that people take in the desert is called doing siestas, which is just like day naps. And so you'll usually in the desert, you'll start about walking about 5:30 a.m., which is about maybe an hour or two before the sun actually rises and starts warming up where you are. And you'll try to do as much of your walking as you can before, say, like 10 or 11 a.m. whenever it's like peak heat. And then once that time reaches, you pretty much don't walk almost at all up until, say, 4 p.m. when it starts cooling down again, and then you start walking again. And so you have this very interesting like 4 to 5 hour window where you're doing very little walking. Like, you might walk a mile or two or maybe 3 miles, but you're not doing the bulk of your walking in that time. You just you're taking a nap, or you're just hanging out and talking with friends. And, some of my greatest memories of trail come from these moments of siestas where it's just so many people huddled together in some shady spot for hours and having nothing to do but just talk to each other. I mean, there's a lot of really awesome memories that can come from that. And so that was most of the uncomfortability of this desert. In the Sierras, you're dealing with high altitude environment, and so Mount Cook in New Zealand, I think, is about 10,000 feet high. Maybe I'm not sure what the actual height of it is exactly, but I know it's in like around 10,000 to 12,000 feet. Whereas on the Sierras, the average elevation that you're usually at is about 12 to 13,000 feet at a time, and you're never going lower than that really. And with that brings a lot of issues with altitude sickness. And so a lot of people, it doesn't really matter how fit you are. Some people will react to the altitude differently. And so for me, whenever I was in the Sierras, I had a really bad issue with, I could probably only walk 0.1 miles, or let's say, let's just say 0.1 kilometers at a time before I had to take a rest. And because I was like breathing too heavily because the air was thinner than I was used to. And so you don't have as much oxygen coming in, so your body's not working as efficiently, and then you start getting lightheaded, and you start getting headaches, and that can be in its own entirely different issue. And it's very interesting because this is the time that you're huffing and puffing is also, and the time that your body can't act as efficiently is also the time that it needs to act efficiently, because that's where the terrain is steepest, because you're in the mountains now, and so you're climbing a lot of mountains and going over a lot of passes. And so, those require a lot of physical fitness, but your body can't work as efficiently at higher altitudes, and so it's this weird kind of, when you need it the most, you don't have it, kind of thing. And so that was the issue with the Sierras, or the challenges of the Sierras. And then really NorCal NorCal to Washington was kind of or Northern California, I should say, not NorCal. Northern California to Washington State was the other really, had its own set of challenges. Mainly when you get to Northern California, there's something called NorCal Blues, which is something that happens to a lot of people where they just come out of the Sierras, which is almost objectively the highlight of the trail. And now it's almost like, that the best is behind you at this point, and now you're kind of just walking to Canada, and that's all you're working towards at that point. And so there tends to be this kind of bluesy state that a lot of people go through, and that I also went through, that I wasn't expecting myself to go through, where you realize, okay, yeah, like, what am I walking for at this point? The thing that I'm walking towards is still more than halfway away. Like, I'm not even halfway there, and I just finished the best part of the trail, hypothetically. And so you really need to want to get to Canada at that point to get there. It's a lot more grit is needed from that point onward. And so really the terrain is easier, but it's the mental game that you're trying to manage. And that's the biggest challenge. And the biggest level of uncomfortability that you're in NorCal is just trying to manage your boredom and trying to keep yourself entertained while you're walking, and finding interesting ways to occupy your time.
That sounds kind of scary, especially in the desert, not having that water. I know that would make me very, very uncomfortable. And it sounds like military training almost. A lot of people in the military, a few different training programs, they don't drink water for a few days, or don't drink much water, and they have to forage for food and things like that. So it sounds like military training. Now, with that, I imagine comes, well, what if you drink all your water too quickly? Or what if you run out of water? You've got another day, you've got 2 days to go. What would you do in that scenario? Would that be something that would be a cause for concern? You'd need to put out a distress beacon. Would you have to ask other people? What would you do in that scenario? Maybe even you unintentionally dropped your water, and now it's on the ground, and you're like, oh shit, what do I do now? It's got to have happened to somebody.
Oh, I'm sure it has. I'm sure it's happened to people where they have water in the desert, and they're boiling the water to make dinner, and then they tilt their stove and it all falls everywhere. That's bad. And so that's why a lot of the time you try your best to do is there's dry camping, there's wet camping, or I guess just camping. And dry camping is whenever you're sleeping not around a water source anywhere, and so you kind of have to really conserve your water that you use for camp. You try to do as little of that as possible, and it's very hard to not dry camp because there's only so many water sources. But thankfully, the amount of water that you're carrying wouldn't have to last you days. It would just have to last you, usually like 15 to 20 miles or 30 kilometers ish, and that could be done in a day. Especially at the point that those water carries happen or those stretches happen, your trail fitness is high enough that you can cover that distance in a day relatively easily, or you should be able to cover it pretty easily. But in the scenario that someone ran out of water and they had to camp, I don't think it wouldn't be something that would call for hitting an SOS or anything at that point. I think it would be if it persisted for days, or if it was especially hot and they were showing signs of heat stroke or something. Then that would be something that you would then potentially hit a distress beacon or SOS for. But in that scenario, most people on this trail are hiking with other people, and unless everyone by some act of God made the same mistake, they'll be able to ration the water with them. And that kind of thing. But you try your best not to put yourself in that scenario, because it doesn't feel great to take other people's water when they especially also need it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I can imagine. And how much water do you usually carry over the desert? Because you mentioned rationing. Why not just carry more? Why not just carry 5, 6, 7, 8 liters? I know it would be heavier, but you'd still feel more comfortable, right? You'd just be able to drink as much as you want.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a balance to be struck there, isn't there? Where you want to. So the way I did it was usually I carried about 1.5 liters more water than I thought I would need to in the desert, just so that if for some reason, I got there, I had to sleep overnight between water sources, I wasn't going to be between a rock and a hard place. I was going to be able to manage myself. And so, yeah, but the thing is, if you carry too much water, then all of a sudden, I mean, water is very heavy. And so, the more water that you're carrying, I think like 1 liter of water is about 1 kg, I think. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I know 1 liter of water is 2.2 pounds. 2.2 pounds, I think, is around 1 kg.
Yeah.
But in any case, yeah. In any case, though, it never feels comfortable to carry more water than you need to, because you just feel like you wasted the water that you carry. Like you get to the next water source, like, well, I had 2 liters of water left, so why am I carrying
Right.
this? And so then you're like, well, maybe I should just carry less water on this next stretch. And that's what tends to happen, is you get to the next, like it almost always happens that way. And then eventually you start thinking, I'm just going to carry what I think I need. And in the Sierras, where there's a lot of water, a lot of times you just don't carry water at all. You just walk without water until you get to the next river, and then you just drink from that river. And I did that a lot in the Sierras and in NorCal. You kind of just walk without water, because the weight, you definitely feel the weight difference if you don't have water on your back. It's insane.
It sounds like it's a really experience that makes you really, in a sense, confront your mortality, right? Or aspects of it. Not being safe,
Yeah.
not being protected, being in a harsh environment. A bear could attack you in the middle of the night. I'm guessing in America, not in New Zealand.
Yeah.
We don't have anything.
No bears and no snakes.
Yeah, no snakes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was I was never concerned about bears, because the bears on the West Coast, they're, grizzly bears are the ones you have to worry about. Those are the ones that tend to be a bit more aggressive towards humans than black bears, which are the ones that are on the West Coast along the trail. And so black bears are pretty much just really big dogs. And so if you can manage a dog, then you could probably manage a bear. It's just a lot scarier doing so. Like the bear encounters that I've had, it was like 2 bears that were definitely at least 3 times my size. And they were like, there was one that was in group. There was like 2 of them at the same time. They were walking towards me, and you just have to really just dig your heels in, and you start yelling at them and clacking your heels and walking towards them, because if you turn your back to them, there's this instinct of chase that can enter their mind, and they'll start going towards you, and that's not what you want. And so I saw these bears that hadn't seen me yet, and they were going towards me, but I had seen them. And so I remember what I did was I just got my phone, and I was like, there's this cameraman never dies tactic that I see in movies all the time, where the person that's recording the event is never the one that's in danger. And so I thought, I'm going to record this, and I'm just going to start yelling at the bears and walking like almost jogging towards them. And I just started yelling at them. They both perked their ears up, and they started darting the other way. And I was like, thank God. That could have, like, it was a very, I knew I was fine, but it was just took a lot of willpower and a lot of guts to scream at two bears that are much bigger than you.
That's hilarious. I want to see this video now.
Yeah, I mean, I can send it to you if you want.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah.
But no, another time that, on the topic of confronting your own mortality, there was a section, like in Northern California, it was about a day away from reaching Oregon State. And we went from this one town, and the next town was about 2 or 3 days away. And so we left that morning and got about, say, 20 miles in or 30 kilometers in, and we saw a fire. And wildfires are a big problem in the area. And so one of my friends had called a non-emergency line, and just because we happen to have service at this point, and just said, hey, we're just wondering, like, we want to know the update on this fire that we're seeing. And they were told, oh, don't worry about the fire, it's okay, we're well aware of it, but there's 2 natural fire breaks being something that should stop a fire from getting past fire break. They said that there's 2 fire breaks in between where you are and the fire. You should be fine to keep going. Like, okay, great. And so we kept our eye on it, and there was a very obvious plume of smoke coming from the entire time. And we get to camp, and we set up everything. We're starting to make dinner. We're eating dinner, and the wind really picks up out of nowhere. It was almost within minutes that the wind went from calm to hurling. And the wind was in such a way that it was blowing the fire towards us, and there was ash falling from the sky. And, there was ash on all of us. There was ash on our food, ash on our tents. And so then that's whenever we thought, okay, maybe this is a little bit more intense than we had anticipated. And so there was about 15 people at this camp, and we all just decided that we were going to use my SOS beacon thing, the distress beacon, to call to like kind of get an update on what's going on, because it turns out that you could use those SOS buttons without actually in a non-emergency way. Like, that doesn't mean that search and rescue's got to come out to you via helicopter immediately. You have to request it. And so we hit the SOS button, and all of a sudden I get a call from the sheriff, I get a call from search and rescue, and all my emergency contacts are notified of what's happening immediately. But the issue is happening at 1 a.m. for all my emergency contact sides. So like some of them didn't receive it, but like my family did. So now they're actually following this. And search and rescue is telling me to get out of the area immediately because the area is in danger. And the sheriff for that local district was telling me, listen, man, professionally, I'm going to tell you that you should evacuate because that's what I'm meant to be telling you here. But man to man, I'm going to tell you, you're probably going to be fine. I've camped closer to fires than you are right now. There's 2 natural fire breaks still. You'll be absolutely fine. You probably, he didn't say I was overreacting. He was just saying there might be like a kind of like a group drama that's like, one person's over dramatizing, and so it raises everyone else's or heightens everyone else's mood to some degree. He said, I think there might be a little bit of that going on. So I would just, if you want me to find you a road that you can evacuate from and arrange a pickup from, we can do that. But I don't think it's needed. And I said, okay, thanks, man. I hung up on him, and our group decided, fuck it, we're going to just evacuate anyways because we don't want to take our chances on this. And so at this point, it's about 11 at night, and so it's it's dark, and the nearest road is about 11 miles or 18 kilometers north. And so we all start walking, and 5 minutes into us walking, we get, a lot of my friends, they have their little satellite phones, and the satellite phone doubles as an SOS device. So everyone starts getting messages saying, "Oh yeah, the fire just jumped both fire breaks," which was the river and the highway. And he says, so now the fire is in our vicinity, and who knows what's going to happen at that point? Yeah, because they said that it jumped both fire breaks and it spread 3 miles in all directions pretty much within minutes. And we were at this point about 4 miles away from the fire, and the trail, it doesn't just go north; it veers towards the fire first, and then it goes north. And so we were like going towards the fire as the fire was going towards us. And at one point, someone thought maybe it's a good idea to turn around and go back the way we came, but it turns out that there was a fire on that end as well. So now we're kind of between two fires, and so it's kind of like a race against the clock to some degree. And so we got picked up. There was about 17 hikers in this ute, in this pickup truck, and we all had just crammed all our packs into the bed, and it was a very uncomfortable 4-hour ride on this dirt road. We were going about 3 miles an hour because it was 20, it was about 20 people in the car. It's weighing down the pickup truck quite a bit, and it's making it a very rough ride for everyone. And it turns out, by the time we got to the next town, and I had service again, I got a call from the sheriff, and I picked it up, and he said, "Dude, you have no idea how happy I am to hear your voice. Literally minutes after I got off the phone with you, the fire that I told you was not going to jump the fire breaks, jumped the fire breaks, and then spread 3 miles in minutes in all directions. And we had no idea where it was going to go." And he said, "I tried calling you over and over again, but you must have been out of service." And it was very apologetic. And he said, "Yeah, like the section that you were walking through had burned down by the time that you had gotten out." And he was like, he's like, "You are very lucky that you made the moves that you did." And that was definitely one of those moments where you didn't realize how close you were to potentially not getting out of that until after the matter.
Yeah, right. Man, that's insane. Better to be safe than sorry, right? I'm so glad you didn't listen to the sheriff, but
Yeah, definitely would have been not the greatest decision.
No, not at all. Not at all. Wow. So what's next for you after these two trials? Are you going to have a break, or do you have something else planned in the future?
I think for the next few years, mostly take a break, not do any of these big adventures. I'll probably, make my move to Denver next year, and I think that in and of itself will be its own adventure because I'm kind of resetting to some degree, and so I'll do that. And then, there's smaller through hikes that I might do, like the Colorado Trail, which goes through, the length of Colorado, and there's other trails like that as well, but they're about 500 miles, and so they're not as big of commitments as these like thousands of miles long trails. And so, anything can change. Again, I might do an ultra marathon in a few years, for all I know, even though I really do not like running. Maybe I'll find myself doing that as well. But right now, I think my sights are set on, kind of learning the ropes of climbing, which is something I got into after the trail, and kind of getting my feet underneath me in Denver. And then once I do that, maybe another trail will be calling my name, and I'll be jumping on that.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Harrison. It's really fascinating to hear about these trails, and I learned a lot today. So thank you. Is there any?
Dylan, thanks for having me.
Is there any social media that you would like to share, or are you a private guy?
No, I have social medias, but I never posted them unless I'm on trail. So
yeah, no problem. Thank you for being here.
Appreciate it for having me.